pain and joy, suffering and triumph that was involved in the move between version 2 and version 3. The following is a conversation with Guido van Rossum, his second time on this podcast. He is the creator of the Python programming language and is Python's emeritus BDFL, benevolent dictator for life. This is the Lex Friedman podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Guido van Rossum. Python 3.11 is coming out very soon. In it, CPython claimed to be 10 to 60% faster. How did you pull that off? And what's CPython?
CPython is the last Python implementation standing, also the first one that was ever created. The original Python implementation that I started over 30 years ago.
So what does it mean that Python, the programming language, is implemented in another programming language called C?
What kind of audience do you have in mind here? People who know programming?
No, there's somebody on a boat that's into fishing and have never heard about programming, but also some world-class programmers. So you're going to have to speak to both. Imagine a boat with two people. One of them has not heard about programming and is really into fishing, and the other one is like an incredible Silicon Valley programmer that's programmed in everything. C, C++, Python, Rust, Java. He knows the entire history of programming languages, so you're going to have to speak to both.
I imagine that boat in the middle of the ocean.
Yes.
I'm going to please the guy who knows how to fish first.
Yes, please. He seems like the most useful in the middle of the ocean. You got to make him happy.
I'm sure he has a cell phone, so he's probably very suspicious about what goes on in that cell phone, but he must have heard that inside a cell phone is a tiny computer. And a programming language is computer code that tells the computer what to do.
It's a very low-level language. It's zeros and ones, and then there's assembly, and then...
Oh, yeah, but we don't talk about these really low levels because those just confuse people. I mean, when we're talking about human language, we're not usually talking about vocal tracts and how you position your tongue. I was talking yesterday about how when you have a Chinese person and they speak English, this is a bit of a stereotype. They often don't know, or they can't seem to make the difference well between an L and an R. Mm-hmm. And I have a theory about that, and I've never checked this with linguists, that it probably has to do with the fact that in Chinese there is not really a difference, and it could be that there are regional variations in how native Chinese speakers pronounce that one sound that sounds to L to some, like L to some of them, like R to others.
So it's both the sounds you produce with your mouth throughout the history of your life and what you're used to listening to. I mean, every language has that. Russian has...
Exactly.
The Slavic languages have sounds like zh, the letter zh. Like Americans or English speakers don't seem to know the sound zh, zh. They seem uncomfortable with that sound.
Yeah.
So yes. Okay. So we're not going to the shapes of tongues and the sounds that the mouth can make. Fine.
And
words.
Similarly, we're not going into the ones and zeros or machine language. I would say a programming language is a list of instructions like a cookbook recipe that sort of tells you how to do a certain thing. Like make a sandwich. Well, acquire a loaf of bread, cut it in slices. Take 2 slices, put mustard on one, put jelly on the other or something, then add the meat, then add the cheese. Mm. I've heard that science teachers can actually do great stuff with recipes like that and trying to interpret their students' instructions incorrectly until the students are completely unambiguous about it.
With language, see, that's the difference between natural languages and programming languages. I think ambiguity is a feature, not a bug in human spoken languages. Like, that's the dance of communication between humans.
Well, for lawyers, ambiguity certainly is a feature. For plenty of other cases, the ambiguity is not much of a feature, but we work around it, of course. Well, what's more important is context.
So with context, the precision of the statement becomes more and more concrete, right? But, when you say, I love you to a person that matters a lot to you, the person doesn't try to compile that statement and return an error saying, please define love, right?
No, but I imagine that my wife and my son interpret it very differently.
Yes.
Even though it's the same 3 words.
But imprecisely still.
Oh, for sure.
Lawyers would have a lot of follow-up questions for you.
Nevertheless, the context is already different in that case.
Yes, fair enough. So that's a programming language, is ability to unambiguously state a recipe. Actually, let's go back. Let's go to PEP 8. You go through in PEP 8, the style guide for Python code, some ideas of what this language should look like, feel like, read like. And the big idea there is that code readability counts. What does that mean to you? And how do we achieve it? So this recipe should be readable.
That's a thing between programmers. Because on the one hand, we always explain the concept of programming language as computers need instructions, and computers are very dumb and they need very precise instructions because they don't have much context. In fact, they have lots of context, but their context is very different. But what we've seen emerge during the development of software, starting probably in the late 40s, is that software is a very social activity. A software developer is not a mad scientist who sits alone in his lab writing brilliant code. Software is developed by teams of people. Even the mad scientist sitting alone in his lab can type fast enough to produce enough code so that by the time he's done with his coding, he still remembers what the first few lines he wrote mean. Mm-hmm. So even the mad scientist coding alone in his lab would be sort of wise to adopt conventions on how to format the instructions that he gives to the computer. So that the thing is, there is a difference between a cookbook recipe and a computer program. The cookbook recipe, the author of the cookbook writes it once, and then it's printed in 100,000 copies. And then lots of people in their kitchens try to recreate that recipe, that particular